Hi, everyone.
Hi.
My name is Eleanor. I am one of the co-founders of What's Your Grief, and this is What's Your Grief's lovely intern, Taylor.
Hi.
We are broadcasting tonight a webinar on coping with grief in the new year. We add the new year because we know right now a lot of people are probably thinking about going into 2019. Maybe some people are worried, thinking about it with dread. Maybe people are seeing it as a fresh start, but one thing we know is that it's often on people's minds, just the passage of time and where they are as they head into the new year. So every year around this time, we have a little webinar to talk about just coping in general, so we can all get kind of a fresh start and start on a page where we feel like we have a few constructive tools for moving forward. So as you notice, Lisa, my fellow co-founder, is not here with us tonight. She is so sorry she can't make it. She has another event where she's talking to an author of a grief book here locally in Baltimore. So we kind of are double booked tonight, but she will definitely be on all the webinars throughout the rest of the year, and we'll share with you our schedule for the rest of the year at the end of this webinar. So as I said, we're so glad that you all have made it. If you haven't participated in a Zoom webinar, there are a couple of ways that people can connect, and that's why we love Zoom. One of the ways that we like to use is through the chat. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you see there are a couple of different little tools down there. One says chat. We would love it if you could open that up, and then you'll see a box pop up. And at the very bottom where it says, there's a section where you can type your message, and it says to. Go next to where it says to, click on that blue bubble there, and just make sure it says all panelists and attendees, so that we can make sure that everybody, both panelists and your fellow attendees, are seeing the conversation. Unfortunately, once we get started in the webinar and share our screen, we aren't able to see the chat the entire time. So I think what we'll do is we'll kind of toggle back and forth between the presentation and opening the chat back up. If we miss a question, I'm so sorry. We'll try and leave some space at the end for any questions in case things get lost in the chat area as we're going through. So unless people have any questions that they want to throw in the chat right now at the get-go, we are going to get started and talking about just everything that we have in store in this webinar tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Okay. So as we said already, we are talking tonight about coping with grief in the new year. And as I said, this is a topic that we think is important year round, whether it's January or June. There's never a right or wrong way to think about just some tools for coping with grief, maybe to think about all the coping that you've already been doing to cope with grief, maybe some of the things that you want to change about how you're maybe dealing with stress in the context of your life after loss. But we do know that this topic can be fresh on people's minds as we head into the new year. And that's why we always have this conversation around this time. Briefly, most of you are registered because you got our newsletter, I believe, that announced this webinar. So you should have an idea of who we are. My name is Eleanor. As I said, I'm one half of the co-founder team for What's Your Grief. Lisa, I'm sorry again to those who might have joined late, couldn't make it, but we have our intern Taylor, who's been here. How long have you been here now? Almost a year. So she's been with us for a while. So she is going to join us to talk about some of the webinar as well. So What's Your Grief, as you all hopefully know, is primarily a website where we have hundreds of articles on all sorts of different topics. We try and leave no stone unturned in the things that we talk about, all types of loss, all types of grief experiences, all types of coping. We are always open to suggestions for topics that you would like to see addressed as we move forward and continue to write articles. We also do things like podcasts, and as you all are joining us tonight, you know, we do occasional webinar events and local events and things like that. We've been in existence since about 2012, so a while now. And we're just so honored that we have a group of people who we consider our kind of grief friends, our readers, who will hop on a webinar and participate in sessions like these. So thank you all for joining us. Did I miss anything? Is there anything you want to add, Taylor?
Yeah, I think you covered everything.
All right, great. So we're going to talk about coping, as you know, but before that, we want to just start giving a little bit of outline about just some basic understandings that we hold to be true about grief. And at this point, I'll reference the fact that we earlier sent out an email that had a PDF attached that was a coping with grief workbook. This is not something you need to have on hand or have printed to participate in this webinar, but I just want to mention that that workbook, it has a lot of the stuff that we talk about outlined there, and then a couple of different activities and things that people can do. So whenever you get a chance, if you'd like to pull that PDF up and just look through it, it can be a helpful resource for people, a helpful reminder about some of the stuff that we're talking about. So with that, I'm gonna pass it over to Taylor just to talk about some of the basic truths about grief that we think are important to really understand as we move forward in talking about grief and coping with grief.
Yeah, so one of the first things that we talk about when we're going over grief is that grief is not one size fits all. It's not just that everyone goes through grief and everyone goes through it one way, but it can be a lot of different things. And a lot of times when people think about grief, they're thinking of sadness and crying and the emotional side of it. But there are so many other emotions and feelings that come along with that. So we kind of want to go over that tonight. And although a lot of people, when they think of grief, they're thinking of loss in the form of a death of a loved one, it can also mean so many other things, whether that's loss of a relationship, loss of an identity, loss of something, an ideal that you had, or a belief system that you had. So there are so many forms that grief and loss can take. And so we also want to go over that a little bit.
Yeah, and these things are so important to understand, because if we think of grief as a one-size-fits-all type of thing, if we think everybody's grief is the same, then it seems like, oh, well, everybody's coping should be pretty similar. But what we know is that grief is so unique to the person that you are and the ways that you tend to cope and your strengths and your resources, and also to the relationship that you had with the person who died and your ongoing connection with that person. And so that is so important. And then what Taylor mentioned, where grief is more than just sadness, it's more than just emotion. If we can expand our understanding of the many different things that we go through as a result of experiencing a loss, then we understand that there's so many different things that we need to cope with. And so we might need a really kind of big toolbox of things to help us meet all those different stresses and challenges. So that's really important. Speaking of that, secondary loss.
Yeah, so that's another thing that we talk about when we're talking about grief is the secondary loss. So not only are you losing a person, but you might be losing other things that were affected by that loss. So some of the things that we have on the slide are loss of income if your significant other or your family member, whoever was that main source of income. So now you lost them, but you also lost that. You can have the loss of identity. So if you're a mom or a dad or a brother or sister, maybe you see yourself in a different light now that you're experiencing that loss. It can be a loss of dreams of the future, of your faith or belief system, or how you view the world, because now this terrible thing has happened. A loss of confidence and self-esteem, a loss of a support system if your family now doesn't know how to all cope the same, or you're all having different feelings around the grief of the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a short list. And so we're actually gonna, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now and pull up the chat. Somebody asked if we could get close to the mic. I'm gonna pull it a little closer to us. Sorry, I don't know why our audio is giving us such trouble tonight. Hopefully you can hear us a little bit better now. But one of the things we wanted to ask you all is just, what are some of the secondary losses that you found to be really significant and impactful in your experience since your loss? So, you know, the primary loss, often people will say, is that first domino that falls, and then many other dominoes fall until your life almost sometimes can look unrecognizable. And so we're just interested, what are some of the different secondary losses? If people don't mind sharing in the chat, maybe you'll find that some people are struggling with things that you don't have to face, or maybe you're finding that people who are also on this webinar are going through some of the similar experiences and losses that you are. I see somebody Michelle shared loss of dreams for a particular future.
Yeah.
Yes, that is one we hear people mention all the time. Loss of hopes and dreams for the future. And this might mean loss of hopes and dreams that we had for ourselves, but it also might mean that we thought this person was going to have this type of life. We thought our child was going to grow up and get married and have kids, and I was going to have grandkids, and then because of a death, or maybe because of something else like an addiction, that future doesn't look exactly as we had envisioned it. So this is one that we hear people mention all the time. It can be such a struggle for people as they try to move forward because they had an idea of what the future was going to look like, and now it just seems kind of unclear. Loss of future dreams. Yeah, loss of confidence and sense of self. Absolutely. So many people experience this, and it's not one that you immediately associate with grief. People don't expect to lose their confidence after experiencing a loss, but it's really pretty common for people when we have a loss of faith in just the world in general, maybe our coping abilities, maybe our support system, we begin to feel more vulnerable and fragile, and so this can happen quite often. Loss of a loving and supportive grandmother. So yes, those fractures in our support system, loss of people who were here for us, loss of security. Yeah, so there are a lot of really good ones being shared. I don't mean good in the sense that they're good, but in the sense that they're really significant and relevant.
A lot of spouse to grow old with.
Yes, it goes along with the future, loss of a spouse to grow old with. Loss of functioning of the family system. Yes, so families, as Taylor mentioned, everybody's coping with the same loss, but maybe coping differently. Maybe that loss has really changed what that family looks like, the roles that people take on, the way that people relate to one another. And this is so common. And when we talk about support systems, that family that might have been the primary support system now may be a source of stress as opposed to support. So that is something that is so common. And yeah, loss of whole immediate family. So those people have shared a couple there. Please feel free to keep on sharing. I'm going to go back to sharing our screen so we can keep talking about some of the stuff that we wanted to talk about. So those are our secondary losses. And if you do have the workbook, or if you plan to open up the workbook at some point, you'll see that we do have an activity where we ask people to list some of the secondary losses. The reason we think this can be helpful is because it can give you a visual of the many different things that you are coping with. And so sometimes we don't even fully realize the many different challenges that are being placed on us. We think of that primary loss as being the main stressor, the main source of our grief. And then when we list these things out, we realize, like, oh my gosh, like we are having to deal with so much. And so it can be helpful to see what we're dealing with, right? And then, as I said, to think about the many different things that we really do need tools to cope with. Something that we want to address before getting into constructive types of coping is just what coping means in general. Because the term coping, especially when we talk about grief and life after loss, the term coping gets thrown around a lot. And I think oftentimes it gets kind of lumped in with things are synonymous with it, like support groups and seeing a grief counselor. And yeah, those are great ways to cope. But coping is such a bigger and more broad term than just thinking about things like that. So we want to take a few minutes to just talk about what is coping. Before we can talk about some of the more constructive things, I think we need to talk about the fact that coping is not inherently positive. So many times people hear coping, how are you coping? And they think it's going to be a positive, right? But coping really just encompasses any response, any action, any behavior that we have to try and master, reduce, or tolerate the demands of stress going on in our lives. So anything that we do to try to master, reduce, or tolerate perhaps the pain of our loss, or any other things that we're experiencing. So we're trying to get a desired physical or emotional response to a situation or stimulus. Now, this doesn't mean that this has to be something positive and constructive that we do. There are many ways that people cope that are actually the opposite of constructive. They might have bigger consequences for our life on a whole, maybe our health, maybe our connections with other people, they negatively impact. However, we do them because they do allow us to avoid some of that pain, right? And so at the heart of most negative coping is avoidance. So if we are using substances, maybe we're trying to numb or avoid pain. If we are withdrawing from everyone else, maybe it's because we have had a number of encounters with other people in our support system who have hurt our feelings or let us down. And so we're trying to avoid that experiencing being repeated. Maybe we're worried if we go out into public. We're going to encounter grief triggers and become emotional, so it's easier to just stay at home and to avoid. And so we know that avoidance can be at the heart of a lot of negative coping. Now, that said, there are grief theories out there, and we fully believe that some avoidance of our grief, so taking a break from our grief, can be helpful and adaptive at times. So it might be that you just aren't ready to go out. You plan to go out someday or soon enough, right? But you're just not there yet. Or it might be that you've had a really stressful week and you need to take a weekend to get a break. So some avoidance can be helpful in grief. What we want people to be mindful of when we talk about avoidance is it chronic? So is it ongoing in a long-term way? And is it really getting in the way of us living a life in accordance with our values? So if maybe we consider ourselves a religious or spiritual person and we always went to church every week, and not only that, but we had a support system at church, but now we are afraid that once we get there and we see the choir, our spouse used to sing in the choir, we're gonna start getting emotional and crying, so we just avoid that experience altogether. So it makes sense because you're avoiding that pain, but at the same time, perhaps it's cutting you off from that value that you had, maybe connecting with other people in your faith or going to church and acknowledging your faith in that sort of way. So that's just one example, and we see this play out a lot. And some examples, some ways that avoidance can impact us are pretty obvious, but sometimes it can be a little harder to spot, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the ways we kind of look at that is adaptive behavior and maladaptive behavior. So we kind of look at that on a continuum. And one of the examples we like to give is with parenting. So a parent that uses all of their time and energy to take care of their kids. And while that seems like a good thing, you're being a good parent, you're nurturing your children, at the same time, you're kind of using that to avoid dealing with your own grief. And then it can also be on the opposite side of that. You don't care about anyone else right now because you're not nurturing your kids, you're only focusing on your own needs. So you kind of want to strive for balance and not be on either side of that.
Yeah, exactly. And with this example, we've talked to so many parents who said, my grief has been delayed because I spent so long just trying to raise my kids who were grieving. I didn't have any time to think about myself, and now I'm finally coming back and revisiting the loss and realizing I didn't take time to grieve. And this is something we might not even realize we were doing because it's instinctual to take care of your kids, right? But it's also instinctual maybe to avoid your pain and to put other people's pain first, right? So what we want to do is really push ourselves to find that balance, and also be mindful that some of these behaviors that allow us to avoid, like spending all our time focusing on the needs of other people. It might not be our kids, it might be our family. Maybe we have somebody in our family who needs our support and who seems to be struggling, so we throw all of our time and attention into that person. It also, we see this with people who maybe like channel their stress into things like exercising, right? So sometimes people will channel it all into that and they're exercising to an extreme degree where it's not helpful or healthy. We hear of people who go back to work right away, which is fine if that's where you are and that's how you feel. However, we have heard from people who said, I went back to work, but then I started working an 80-hour work week because I didn't want to go home and face the fact that my house was empty. So we see a lot of behaviors that seem really helpful and positive, that if we really look at what's at the heart of it, there might be some avoidance there. Now, we're not saying definitely, right? Sometimes these behaviors make total sense, but that's why we're saying this is individual, and we're asking everybody to kind of look at their coping and see what is at the heart of it, what is driving that behavior. So as Taylor just said, this can be difficult to spot, right? Because sometimes it looks, something that looks helpful or adaptive can become unhelpful or maladaptive. So some of the questions you might ask yourself, if this rings true for you, if not, that's fine, good. Is the behavior reasonable? So is it balanced? What purpose does the behavior serve? Is it meeting a need? And what need is that? And when might it be too much? So we're going to take a second and ask people. Now, it feels like we're putting you on the spot and asking you for confession time here. The thing that I want to note is that everybody has these negative coping skills. We all have them, and we all employ them, and we all do them from time to time. So having them is nothing to be ashamed of. Let's rephrase that question and just say, what are some of the behaviors that you know can be negative coping? So it doesn't have to be your own. It doesn't have to be a confession. It can be. But what are some of the things that maybe you know people do? Maybe you've seen friends do it, family do it, or things like that? Shopping, yes, shopping.
Yes.
And there is real reason why shopping and acquiring things can feel really good. It gives us that boost.
It releases endorphins.
Yeah, it releases endorphins, because at one time when there was scarcity, we didn't have enough, we had to hunt and gather, right? Getting things was really adaptive. So these are behaviors that are rewarded in a very neurochemical way. So that definitely makes sense. And we all have heard the term retail therapy. Binge watching, yes, right? So it's like, oh, one more show. I did want to go walk the dog for a half hour, but you know what? I'm not feeling like it, and I just really want to watch this other show. And now Netflix and Amazon and all these streaming services has made this so easy for us to do. So that can be kind of one that we are all guilty. I will say for sure that I am guilty of that one. Alcohol, yes, of course. So any substance, especially alcohol, one that we might socially use, might, once we're experiencing a really stressful time, that stressor might tip the scales to a point where we're drinking a lot more than we were drinking before. And sometimes drinking more than we really feel comfortable can creep up on us. So we don't even realize we're doing it until we step back and say, wow, I think I've drank a bottle of wine several nights this week, or every night this week, right? So it's keeping an eye on some of these behaviors before they get out of control, or at a point where we feel like, oh, maybe it's too much, being able to step back and recognize that. Ate a bag of cookies for dinner. Yes, that is so relatable. Thank you for sharing that. When we are stressed out and tired and we just say, who cares, right? We're going to grab the bag of cookies for dinner, right? Because it's easy, and because it's a comfort food and it makes us feel good, and it's there, and we aren't in the mindset to go out and like make a salad or whatever. So absolutely, I think we've all been there where we've eaten the comfort food because it's easy and because it makes us feel good. Sleeping, yes, absolutely. So sleeping a lot. Maybe it's that you wake up in the morning and you're like, I can't even face this day. I'm just staying in bed, right? And some people just sleep a ton. And right now, it's winter where we are, it is definitely cold. It is definitely dark. It is hard to get out of the bed in the morning when it is cold, and it just feels so comfortable under those blankets. So absolutely, sleeping can be one. Definitely a way for us to avoid. Isolating, yes, absolutely. Isolating again in the winter, right? When maybe things get canceled, or we don't want to go out in the snow or the slush or the cold. There's less light, there's less time for us to be out and doing things outside. We absolutely have a tendency to hibernate a little bit. And so we ask people to think about, we're not asking you to tomorrow, if you're somebody who has a tendency to spend a lot of time at home and maybe it's starting to feel isolating, we're not asking you to start like making dates for every single day, right? But thinking about, geez, how can I start to move this gauge a little bit back towards a place where I feel more comfortable with it? So, okay, those are really good examples. So thank you all for sharing them. And I can relate to so many of them. So you are definitely not alone if those are applied to you in any way. Another thing that we want to just mention really quickly is looking at some of the, we say looking at the stories. So looking at what we tell ourselves about how we'll cope, when we'll cope, whether we're capable of coping. Somebody mentioned before that they feel really shook in their sense of confidence and sense of self and sense of identity. And I think that this can really it can soak into every part of our existence, including our coping, including our feelings of being capable and being able to take care of ourselves and to help ourselves heal. And so I think that we absolutely can start to tell ourselves stories about whether or not coping, getting to a place of feeling okay, getting a place of feeling quote unquote normal is within our grasp. And there are a lot of stories that we might tell ourselves around this. And a lot of these stories and narratives are kind of grounded in some of our personal attitudes that we have about coping. And we all have these. We all have attitudes about everything, right? And some of the attitudes that we hear quite a lot that really can get in our way, we have listed here on this slide. So the idea that focusing on myself is selfish. Now, when we talked about people who are maybe taking care of kids, you might just be one of those people who's a giver, right? So it's just in your nature to look around and say, who needs to be taken care of? What can I do to help the other people around me? And so when you are a helper like that, you can also tend to think, some people, not all, that focusing on yourself, turning that back around, that care back around to yourself, is a selfish act. So focusing on yourself is not selfish. We want to myth bust that one right here and now. Focusing on yourself can really help you to be a better helper, because you're taking care of yourself and you're making sure that you're in a place where you're solid before you go out and try to help other people. So, but that's one that comes up all the time. Negative coping is quicker and easier. Now, negative coping can be quicker and easier, right? It can be a quicker route and it can be a lot easier. Maybe having a glass of wine feels a lot easier than having 30 minutes of a brisk walk that helps to release, you know, dopamine and endorphins and things like that. But with that, negative coping can have some of those negative long-term consequences, whereas the constructive coping can help us to move that gauge a little bit more and to have some of the more positive benefits and impacts. So while negative coping might seem quicker and easier, it also doesn't get us as far. Coping should be easier. Yeah, that's one. And actually, when we talk about coping and how we conceptualize coping, we want people to realize that coping can be easier than we think it can be. It can be small things that we do to help ourselves to feel better. I don't have time. This is a big one that we will look at in a second, because this is one that people say all the time, and it probably feels very true, because after somebody dies, a lot of times it means that you have to take on new roles and responsibilities. Maybe you have to go back to work to pay your bills. Maybe you're now a single parent. There are a lot of different reasons why your life becomes more hectic, chaotic, and busy after you experience the death of a loved one. So it might feel like you don't have time. Asking for help is a burden. So when we talk about how you might be able to lean on support systems, or be able to get support and help from other people, maybe even just have somebody who helps to keep you accountable, that sort of thing. We often feel like opening up and talking to people about how we're feeling and what we need can be a burden on that person, and we don't want to dump on other people. So that can get in our way. I'll start doing things when I feel better. This is a big one, especially when we're grieving. We think, well, we feel really terrible today. Maybe in a couple months, we'll feel like we're in a little bit better position to go out and do some of the constructive things that we hope to do to cope. And in some ways that is true. We can get to a point where we feel better and start to move forward at that point. But we also know that if we start today to do manageable, easy, small things, that can be what helps us to get to a place of feeling a little bit better. So we don't want to wait around for some unknown day when we're going to feel better. We want to start doing things to help us to feel better. And that can feel real challenging. And on Sundays, it's fine to say, nope, not today. But we do want people to open themselves up to the possibility that if they start to do some things that we'll talk about, it might help to feel a little bit better. And I don't want to talk about it. Yeah, that is one that we hear all the time. And there are days when you're just not going to want to talk about it. And maybe you're not a talker in general. A couple things about that. You don't have to talk about grief to be able to cope with grief. A lot of times people, because we often hear about the go-tos being support groups and counseling, people often think that in order to process and go through their experiences and emotions, they have to talk about it. And while talking can be helpful and we encourage you to give it a try, it's not necessary. There are so many other ways that we can constructively cope with grief that don't involve having to talk about it. So we encourage you to try it if you're open to talking, if you think it might help you to feel better. It does often help us to get some perspective and to feel a little bit better. But if it's off the table for you, that doesn't mean that coping is off the table for you. So just an example of some of looking at these stories and how these stories can play out. A while ago, this wasn't a grief survey. It was just a survey in general where they talked to people about self-care, and they asked them about some of the barriers that they face when thinking about doing self-care and engaging in self-care. And some of the top things that, out of 2,000 people, some of the top things that were noted were things like lack of motivation and time, which I think definitely applies to people who are grieving. That time piece, as we said, can be such a big one. Cost of care. So maybe what you really would like to do is talk to a counselor, but you don't have access to those resources. Maybe you don't have the healthcare benefit of seeing a counselor. Maybe you don't have an EAP, and maybe you talk to a couple counselors and they all charge $130 a session, and that's a lot of money. So the cost can seem overwhelming for people, obviously. Conflicting home and work responsibilities, so that goes back to the idea that I just don't have that time. I have too much on my plate right now to really engage in self-care. And then the differences between what we know and what we do. So a lot of us know that we can engage in self-care without having to pay for it, without having to join a gym, without having to spend an hour every day. We can engage in self-care by taking a 15-minute walk. So we know that, but we don't actually do that because it's easier to binge that Netflix show. So there are a lot of different things that might be true for everybody on this webinar, but some of the ones that were cited here were these ones. But then when they looked at it, one of the things that was cited time and time again was the time piece. And when they looked at it, they said 47% strongly or somewhat agreed with the idea that I would take better care of myself if I had more time to do so. But when they looked at how the people were actually spending their time, they found that while there were some things that people had to be doing or that were constructive, like exercising and going to work and things like that, there was also some time that's being spent that could probably be allocated elsewhere. So for example, 82 minutes on social media, that's actually not that bad. Yeah, I've talked to some people who, now that the iPhone is tracking your phone usage, are like 3 hours on my phone in one day, right? So that can be a lot of time spent there just mindlessly scrolling. And then 230 minutes watching TV, which I think we can all relate to. We all just kind of confess to binging TV from time to time. So there are a couple of places where we might be able to reallocate some time. And so there's an activity in your workbook that we encourage you to give a try because it can be helpful. The idea here is real basic, and this comes from a CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy technique. And the idea here is that there's the way we are spending our time, and then there's the way we would like to be spending our time. And so the first thing that the activity asks you to do, this is just what you're seeing. Uh-oh, what's that? Sorry, stop sharing my screen. I'm gonna go back, okay. So the first thing, in your workbook, there's more to this than just the circles, but I'm showing you the circles so that I can quickly explain the activity. The idea here is in the first circle, we ask you to just kind of pie chart out how you're spending your time. So you can do this in terms of like hours, minutes, whatever, just percentages of how you're spending your time. So time at work, time maybe with the kids, if if that's your life, maybe it's time out with friends, whatever it is, maybe exercising, things like that. And look at how you are spending your time in that pie chart. And look at it and really ask yourself, am I spending time doing anything that helps me to cope with grief, that helps me to maybe feel better? Are there things that I would like to be doing for my well-being or for coping with grief, or things that I need to be doing that I'm not doing that I should add into this circle? And then for the second circle, the one on the right, what we ask you to do is to maybe reallocate some of that time in the first circle and change it around so that you include some of the stuff that you would like to be doing more of, or that you have to be doing more of. So for example, if you have 2 hours of TV in the first circle, well, maybe take 1 hour out of there and give a half hour to taking a class on something that you enjoy, or to journaling, or maybe 10 minutes at the end of the night to write a list of things that you're grateful for. Whatever it is that you want to be doing more of, think about how you can rearrange your time. And the reason why this is something that we recommend is because, again, getting that visual, it seems so small and maybe silly, but getting that visual can be really, really helpful. Sometimes how we think of things in our head, once we change the representation of it out on paper, they can look really different. And they can help us to see, okay, well, this is what I'm dealing with, and this is how I can approach it and master it. So if you have time, we would ask you to take a second to check that out and to try that activity. So now that we've talked about that, let's talk a little bit about some of the constructive things that people can be doing to cope. So what are some of the things that you might want to be adding into your pie chart? And this is going to be so unique depending on who you are and the time that you do have and your resources and your strengths and your preferences and all that good stuff. So we can't tell you, here's how to cope with grief. Here are good ways to cope with grief, right? What we can do is present kind of a conceptualization for thinking about the things that will work for you. And when we think about coping with grief, some of the things that we think are important are identifying realistic coping. So not being totally unrealistic. So I don't ever go to the gym. And if I say now I'm going to start going to the gym 5 days a week, that's probably unrealistic for me. So I should be more realistic and say maybe I'm going to try and go to the gym twice a week, or maybe I don't really even like the gym. So what I'm going to do is try and take the dog for a walk 15 minutes, a day. I keep using the exercise gym example. I think I'm having a little bit of like guilt because I need to be moving more this winter. But this could be anything, right? So identifying realistic coping. What are the things that have worked for you in the past? And what are the things that you think could work for you now? Expand your idea of coping. So think about coping more broadly than maybe you already are. And we'll talk about that in a second. Think about what barriers can be getting in your way. So we talked about attitudes that could be getting in your way. Maybe it's just that your life feels really chaotic and hectic. And before you can start incorporating certain things in your life, maybe the first thing you need to do is impose some structure, right? I'm not a structure person, but I know when I have it, it can really help me. Maybe you want to eat more healthy, but you don't have a budget, or you don't have time to go grocery shopping or anything like that. So first before thinking about I'm going to eat healthy, thinking about like, how am I going to get groceries or fresh foods into my house on a regular basis? So really look at those barriers that can get in the way. Identify your resources. We talked about avoidance, and we'll talk just briefly about setting some goals. The one thing that this is such a basic thing that we always talk about when we talk about coping, and it seems small, but for us, it's really kind of helped us to shape how we think about coping in a way that allows us to consider everything that a person is dealing with in their lives. Really briefly, I'm going to mention a grief theory, and we have articles on this grief theory if you're interested, but there's a grief theory called the dual process model of coping. And what this model says is so basic. It says that we have two different types of stressors that we deal with. We deal with stressors related to our loss and to our grief. So those like emotional experiences, grief triggers, maybe feelings of guilt over the loss and what happened, whatever it is that you're dealing with directly related to that loss and that grief. And then on the other hand, we also at the same time have all these secondary losses, many of the losses that we just mentioned that we're having to face and cope with and deal with. And so these are not just losses, but maybe they're changes, maybe they're stressors that we're now dealing with. Maybe the bills, we don't know how to pay the bills and we need to figure that out. And maybe we have to figure out a new plan for carpool because we're not able to get the kids to school on time. It could be so many different things, but we have so many different stressors that we're dealing with because unfortunately, when somebody dies, we don't get to hit pause on life, right? And we have to deal with life that often looks very, very different than how life looked before. So we have to cope with these two different things. And what we do is we kind of vacillate between coping with each. And then we also, in the middle, need to take breaks sometimes. So we need to do things that allow us to take a break from everything that we're dealing with. And with those breaks, that's perfect opportunity for us to infuse some coping opportunities in there. So when we think about this, coping, we think about it in a similar way that we think about some of that dual process stuff. We think about what types of coping can directly help you cope with your loss. Maybe it is going to that support group. Maybe it is journaling about some of the stuff you've experienced. Maybe it's using a creative outlet that you have, like photography, to really process some of your experiences. But there are a whole number of different ways that we can use to directly cope with that loss and what we're experiencing. And then on the other side of this, we want to think about what are the things we can do to just cope with life and to make ourselves maybe have an increase in well-being. So just in how our general state of being is, and maybe things that help us cope with those stressors, but also the things that allow us to take a break from what we're going through. And so when we talk about well-being, we often think about what positive psychology uses as their kind of formula for well-being. So they say that there are a couple of different pillars that we need to sort of pay attention to, or domains that we need to pay attention to, because they help to increase our well-being. And anything that falls under these headings can be helped to increase our well-being. And those 5 things, very briefly, are positive emotion. So anything that helps to increase our positive emotion, and that is a very broad topic there. It could be something like, I love to watch old stand-up routines on YouTube. I love to play with my cat and roll around on the floor with my cat. I love to go dancing, or I love to turn on the music in my kitchen and have an impromptu dance party. So they can be things like that. Anything that helps you to maybe feel a momentary bit of joy and happiness. Now, this becomes complicated when we're grieving, because a lot of times we feel like if we're feeling happy, we're not grieving. And we really want people to reframe that and understand that grief and happiness or joy or feelings of being okay or laughter or whatever it is, they can exist at the same time. Just because we allow ourselves to go watch a funny movie as a break from what's going on in our lives and laugh doesn't mean we aren't still grieving. So these two things can exist at the same time. The second thing is engagement. So anything that really makes you feel like you're really engaged with what you're doing. Maybe it's something like doing a puzzle. Maybe it's playing music. Maybe it's crossword puzzles, Sudoku, maybe surfing, whatever it is that when you're doing it, time seems to fly by and you're totally immersed in it. The third thing is relationships. So anything that helps to increase your connection with relationships. This is complicated because support systems can be really impacted after a loss, but we also want to reframe this. So we think about things that are big, like connecting with a friend, but also things that are small. So if you're isolating, can you go to maybe the Panera and do work? And at least then you're talking to people and having some connection, right? Meaning, so anything that helps you connect with those things that give you value and meaning and purpose in life. And then finally, accomplishment. And when we say accomplishment, we don't mean things like, you know, we often think with accomplishment like, oh, getting a raise, getting a promotion, graduating. Those are accomplishments, yes. But we also want to think about the little things. Like, I did get up and get out of bed at the time my alarm went off this morning. That's an accomplishment. Say congratulations to yourself for that. Or I did plan to go to that class and I actually went. So accomplishment, we want to reframe as well, big and small things. So with that, let's talk just, in the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip over this and just talk quickly about some real brief examples of the different types of coping.
Yeah, so when we think about coping and grief, like I said earlier, we kind of tend to think of the emotional side of it, but there are actually different ways to view it. So people grieve in different ways. And so that can be emotional, creative, or rational. So for the emotional side of it, it means you want to cry, you want to get mad, you want to talk about your emotions or express your emotions, maybe go to therapy, as we had mentioned earlier. But then maybe that isn't how you handle it. Maybe you want to be more creative about it. So you can do that with art, with music, journaling, if that's what it looks like for you. You know, whatever helps you be creative while you're coping with it. And then some people, again, don't fall into either of those categories, and they're more rational about it. They want to learn what grief is, why are they feeling this way, maybe read about different articles that explain it to them. And not everyone has to fall into only one of the categories. Usually we'll lean more towards one or the other, but we could also check something off in each box. So it kind of just depends.
Yeah, and this is just kind of how we like to think about it. However, there is some research out there to show that there are different types of grievers. So some people may lean really strongly towards their emotions and thinking about how they feel and wanting to process those emotions, while other people may really lean more towards their thoughts and wanting to be really hands-on and active in doing things as a way to cope with their grief. So what we want people to really consider is where are your leanings? What are your tendencies? Some of those things may not feel as helpful to you as they are in the past, especially we hear this from people who are creative copers. They might say, well, I used to love drawing and writing, but now I can't feel it right now. I don't feel it the way I used to. And that's okay. But also think about other ways that you might be able to tap into that creative side that used to be so helpful to you. So thinking about how you tend to lean, and then also opening your mind up and being open to the possibility of trying some that might be outside your comfort zone. Something we often find is that the things that are helpful in grief are the things that we least expected. And then with well-being coping.
Yeah, so that's kind of what she's talking about earlier. You do some coping that's just for grief, and then some that's for your well-being, and then sometimes you find something that does both. It helps you cope with your grief, and it helps with your well-being. So this is kind of just an example of some of those things. Start a journal, meditate, go for a walk. But it's going to be personal for everybody. Yeah. You're going to find what works for you and what doesn't, but maybe you can try something on the list and see if that works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Taylor said, one of the great things when we originally showed our kind of coping conceptualization, it was a Venn diagram where there's this middle point where they overlap. So a lot of times the things that help you cope with your well-being also help you cope with your grief and vice versa. So in the workbook that we shared with you, if you have a moment, you might want to go through, because there's some space where you can brainstorm the things that really work for you. And if you're looking at this list right now, just take note of how big and small some of these are. So just, you know, calling a friend, going to a coffee shop, playing with your pet, talking about your loved ones, maybe sharing a story with somebody, maybe calling somebody who can reminisce about your loved one, maybe looking through photographs, cooking, baking, things like that. So looking at these lists and then thinking about outside of the list, what are the things that you think could be helpful? And I encourage you to think as small or as big as possible. And then can you find ways to incorporate these things into your day-to-day lives? And you know what, a lot of times some of these things are things that we feel like if we're doing them, we're wasting time. If we feel like we should be focusing all on our grief, or we have so much to do, we have so much on our list, we're coping with so much, we feel like sitting down to do a puzzle or to watch a movie or to, you know, go to a coffee shop or look through old photos is maybe wasting our time, but it's not. We encourage you to do these things, even though they might seem like waste of time. They are helpful. They can help to boost your well-being and to help you cope. Now, again, remember what we said, like, we're all for watching a movie, but if you decide to watch movies for an entire week, that might be too much, right? So keeping an eye on balance is really, really key. With that, really quickly, I'd like to go to our chat and just ask, does anybody have, because I think this can be helpful to share some ideas, does anybody have anything that they do that is already a go-to coping that is tried and true, always works for you? I would love to hear, because it can be helpful for us to hear, and it can be helpful for everybody else to know what's working. Music, yes, definitely. So there are so many different ways that music can be helpful. Playing music yourself, so if you play the piano or the trumpet or whatever, flute, whatever it is, violin, playing music yourself can be helpful, but also listening to music. And there is, interestingly, some research to show that even listening to sad music can help us to feel better for a number of different reasons. And we have an article on that that we can share. But listening to music is absolutely. Gratitude journal, yes, that is one that has a lot of research backing that as well, to show that if we regularly keep a practice of maybe daily gratitudes or journaling 3 gratitudes at the end of the day, that can help us to boost our feelings of positivity, well-being, and boost our outlook. Absolutely. Listen to a podcast and cooking. Yeah, so things that maybe just take your mind off of things. Cooking is one that I think really people can get engaged with, where they're totally immersed in what's going on and the world kind of melts away. Podcasts can help to distract you in that way. And also podcasts can have a lot of great information. Yeah. So depending on what types of podcasts you're listening to, they might be really helpful in other ways as well. Take deep breaths. Yes, so I love that example, because it is something so quick and small that we can do to help ourselves to feel better. And again, all these are really grounded in science and research. When we take that deep breath when we're starting to feel stressed and overwhelmed, it signals to our brain, okay, we don't need to start panicking. We don't need to let our stress response take over. It's okay, we're calm, we're at rest. So these are things that can be so small, but that can help. Meditation, yes, absolutely. And again, with meditation, that can be something, if you're really into meditating, that you do for an hour a day, or it can be something that you do for 15 minutes a day. So these things are small things that you can do. A really small thing is making yourself a cup of tea. Yes, definitely. So taking a minute, maybe in the evening, after, you know, maybe everything's settled down, maybe after dinner, after the kids go to sleep, or whatever it is, that you take a minute to pause and just have that nice comforting cup of tea. Going for a walk, looking at foliage. Yes, all these are so wonderful, and I'm so glad to hear people share these. And again, do more of these things, and incorporate more of these things into your life. And if you are wanting to brainstorm some things, we do encourage you to do the workbook, because then you really get a chance to sit and see that on paper. We have an example of something that we use, and we'll go through this really quickly because we're running out of time. But one thing that we use as an example, because it can help us to process our grief, and also it helps with well-being, is photography.
Yeah, so that's something that we can do, and it's on here, it says old and new, so there's different ways that you can use it. The old photos, you can use to cope with, because you can look at photos of your loved one or even having pictures of them out to look at, and something that brings you that comfort and connection to that person or that place maybe that you guys went to together, and something that can just make you happy and make you laugh.
Absolutely.
And then a way that we can do the new photos is the continuing bonds. So even though you're grieving right now, you know, you're always going to have that person with you in some way. And so one of the things that we encourage people to do is to post pictures, maybe if it's a place you went together or a place that you wish they could be. And then like this hashtag says, is would have loved this. So this person would have loved this, you know, they would have loved this activity or this place, and we wish you were here.
Yeah, this is actually, Lisa's not here, but this is her idea, because she started to notice things that her dad, had he lived, would have really appreciated and loved. And she came up with the idea that when she sees those things, she's going to take a photo and she's going to share it and hashtag would have loved this. And that's a quick and easy way to maybe share with people who you know are also grieving and might appreciate it, or to show other people like, this is something that my loved one cared about and would have liked, and this is who they were. So that can be a great way to continue to photograph that ongoing bond. And these are just a couple of examples of things that people have shared with us, of things that their loved ones would have loved. Another one is seeing symbols and signs. If that's something that resonates with you, many people will share that they see a particular bird that really reminds them of their loved one, or maybe it's a time on a clock that reminds them of their loved one, and taking a photograph of those sorts of things. And then finally, we've already talked about this
gratitude. So someone had mentioned that earlier, but even just taking that small time in the day to focus on this, even when it's hard, and even if you think you might not have something to be grateful for, you can probably find something small, and that can really change the perspective for that day.
So these are just an example of a tool that we have found works for us. And actually, if it's something that you want to learn more about or that interests you, we have a number of articles on our website about using photography to cope with grief. If you have creative leanings at all, or even if you don't, interestingly, photography can lean on that creativity, but it also can be kind of a technical, rational thing. So we love it when people share with us that they're trying to use photography to cope with what they're going through. Something that we can really only touch on, because this is a webinar in and of itself, is the support system. As people have mentioned already, that support systems can really be rocked after a loss happens. So it might be that the family is all grieving, and that impacts how the family relates to each other. It may be that those people in your life don't know how to support you. Maybe they're doing a poor job of it. Some people experience disenfranchised grief, which is a way, just a term we use for when people are experiencing grief that other people don't recognize. And so maybe it's a loss that other people are minimizing, or they don't even really know you're going through, or maybe it's a loss that happened a long, long time ago that you're still grieving, and people are at the point where they're like, you're still grieving that. So every loss, I've heard Dr. Worden, a grief researcher, say, and theorists say, that every loss eventually becomes disenfranchised, because we continue to grieve it, but oftentimes society, maybe our family and friends, stop recognizing it as a major source of grief and stress in our life. So, so support systems, they can be iffy. Sometimes people say to us they are so pleased with how their support system responded. And that's great. I'm really hoping that applies to you. But if you have a support system that maybe has been a little rocky, you are certainly not alone. One thing that we do, just to get us started talking about this, we will have a webinar, not until July, but we will have a webinar about this. But in the meantime, we have so many different articles about this on our website. And if you are experiencing something in particular that you want us to point you in the direction of a particular article, feel free to send us an email and we'll try and send you in the right direction. But one thing that we do think can get us started thinking about this is just thinking about how are we utilizing our support system. So one, are we the person who doesn't want to burden our support system? Are we the person who feels guilty asking for help? Or maybe are we so overwhelmed that we don't even know what we need help with? Or are we the person who says, I'm fine, and so people don't know that we need help or how to help us? So how are we utilizing our support system in that way? And then also, are we leaning on the right people for the right sorts of things? So something that we find is often true is that people have strengths and weaknesses, right? We all have strengths and weaknesses as friends and family members. Some people are great for some things and not so great for others, right? So some people are great listeners. Some people are not great listeners. Some people who aren't great listeners might be really good at holding you accountable for doing the things you want to do. So maybe they're really good accountability exercise partner, right? Or maybe people are good at giving really practical advice, but those are the people who never want to sit and listen to you, right? So we all have different leanings, and I can guarantee you in your support system, you have people who are good for different things, right? Maybe you have that friend who you would never open up to, but who's really good for going out and having a night of fun and taking your mind off of things. So we really want people to consider the fact that very few people are all good and very few people are all bad. Most of us are in the middle. Sometimes we say the right thing and do the right thing. Sometimes we're super awkward and stick our foot in our mouth, right? So we want people to consider that, and then to think about their friends and family in a way that's maybe seems a little bit silly, and you don't have to tell them you're doing this, but in a way that really helps you to identify who's the best person to meet what need. So one of the final activities we're going to share here is just thinking about who in your support system is most likely to meet certain needs. And we have some ideas here, but also we have space in the workbook to write down your own needs and then fill in the blanks. And so thinking about, this is like our support system superlatives. If you went to a high school where they did that thing in the yearbook where they said most likely to succeed, best smile, right? Most likely to grow up and become a comedian or a late night host, right? This is similar, right? So most likely to do certain things. So most likely to get me out of the house, right? Most likely to be comfortable with my silence or with my grief emotions. Most likely to be supportive of my children, right? Or to get what I need with regards to supporting my kids, or maybe to help me with my kids, right? So there are a lot of different needs that we might have that different people are going to be good for meeting. And so we encourage you to take a little time to think about the needs that you have, and then see who you would fill in those spaces with, and recognize that some people are beyond second chances, but a lot of people maybe we're just not utilizing in the right way. And one other thing that we want people to be cautious of is if you notice that every single space is filled with the same person, then maybe we want to think about expanding our support system. The same if we have blanks. And when I say expanding our support system, I don't mean that you need to go out and make a bunch of new friends. It's great if that's what you want to do, and if you feel like you can, wonderful. The more the merrier. But it might be that you look in your local community to find organizations that can be helpful. Maybe that's when you do go to a support group. Maybe you have nobody who you can talk to your grief about, but you could go to a support group and talk to people there about it. Maybe that is when you think about seeing a therapist. Maybe if it's something practical like, I need help with my taxes, right? My husband used to do them and I don't do them. That would be very true for me. Maybe that's when you look to see what resources in your community are available to help you get your taxes done, right? So, so thinking about who can fill in these spaces, what do I have access to, what organizations, resources, and people. So we've been going about an hour, so I'm gonna zoom through a little bit. We just wanna finish by talking about actually putting this into play, because we can talk to a verbal in the face about our goals, about our plans, about what we want to do, but oftentimes it isn't until we actually get out our calendar and schedule it in that we actually do it. And that is what we want people to consider doing. We want people to consider actually scheduling these things into their life and into their day, especially if they are struggling. Now, if you're somebody who already is doing things and feel like you already carved that space out for yourself, good. I'm so glad to hear that, and maybe that's not necessary for you. But for many of us, it may be a matter of saying okay, I want to meditate 4 times a week, so I'm going to kind of pencil it in to my morning, and then I'm going to track whether I do it or not. So really being mindful and deliberate about how you do things. And we want people to think about progress as they move forward in coping with whatever they're coping with. We want people to be really fair to themselves in thinking about how they conceptualize their progress. This is something that it comes from behavioral activation, which is actually a therapy that people use with people experiencing depression. But when I heard this, it really became kind of a life changer for me, or a game changer. I don't know, maybe not a life changer. It changed how I would think about things in many ways. And that is, when you think about the progress you've made, ask yourself, what am I comparing myself to? Because a lot of times we have a tendency, especially in grief, to do two things. We compare ourselves to who we were before the loss. And as many of you know, you're never going to be that person again, right? Life has changed now. We are not going to be able to go back to normal, right? Everything's different. So comparing ourselves to who we were before is not fair. If we don't do that, we might compare ourselves to this ideal of who I'll be when I feel better. And so there's this mythical person out there that we compare ourselves to. And until we get to that point, we feel like we're not good enough or we haven't made the progress that we ought to make. But what we want you to do is actually compare yourself to where you started. So thinking about where you were on day one, week one, month one, whatever seems most relevant to you of your experience with loss and grief. And so where did you start? And any steps that you make from that point on is progress, and give yourself credit for that and congratulate yourself for making those steps. Oftentimes we feel like if we're not able to meet this past marker that we were able to meet, or this ideal of who we should be, we think we're not good enough. And we really want people to give themselves credit for the progress that they're making. You all carved out an hour. For some of you, it's after 8, right, at night, primetime TV, right? And for some of you, it's in the middle of your day, depending on where you're tuning in from. This is a step in the right direction. So you have done something, whether or not you even liked this webinar, you have done something to prioritize yourself and your grief. So you should give yourself credit for doing this. This is a step, right? It's a step to prioritize yourself and to cope with grief. So we really want people to be fair to themselves about the progress that they're making. So the last thing that we are asking people to do is to make a little pledge to themselves. And obviously we won't know whether you've actually done this, but it's something that we're challenging you to do, and you might be up for the challenge and you might not. But we would love it if you would consider thinking about some of the ways that you can cope with grief, and also thinking about some of the ways that you can attend to your physical and emotional well-being. So well-being coping and grief coping. And writing down what that coping tool is, and then writing down the details of when, how you will do it. So we kind of want you to pledge to do at least 4 things for yourself in the next week: 2 to cope directly with grief and 2 to cope with well-being. It's okay if they overlap. And really thinking about how you're going to do it. How are you going to get around some of the barriers that are going to get in your way? And we would love for you to try this and let us know. You can email us, and I think we'll share our email in the next slide. You can email us and tell us how it went. We would love to know. And even if you don't get through all 4, again, if you get through 1 or 2, you've done something. It's progress. So congratulate yourself for that. The reason why we want you to commit is because it helps to 4 is because it really helps you to really actually mentally commit, right? And it helps you to think about some of those details and how you'll actually go about it. But if you think 4 sounds like too much, then make it 2. Make it 1 of each. The other thing that might be relevant to you but might not be is if you are somebody who doesn't feel like you're getting the support you need, maybe you are somebody who doesn't ask for help and knows that maybe it would help if you did. This may apply to you. In the next week, maybe commit to asking for certain help in certain areas. So we ask you to identify support needs and the support person you're going to ask. And this might be that your support need is finding somebody to talk to about my grief, and the support person is right in there, research support groups in my area. So just think about it. If there is something in this area that you think would be helpful, go ahead and fill in that section as well. And so with that, I know we've kind of rushed through, but we want to be mindful of everybody's time. And we're going to end there with the actual presentation. I thought we had our information on this slide. I'm going to type our Gmail into the chat right now. It's really simple though. It's whatsyourgrief@gmail.com. We invite you to email us about any questions that you have, about anything that we talked about here, if you want to email us privately. That said, if you have questions that you want to ask now, we would love to take them and answer them. And if we can't answer them, we will do a little digging and get back to you via email. Oh, some people are asking about the workbook. It was sent out in an email. If you didn't get it, Michelle, thank you so much for addressing this with people. If you didn't get it, maybe it ended up in your spam, but if you didn't get it, please email us and we would be happy to forward you a copy. Okay, I see some people talking about some of the morning routine stuff that needs to change. I think that, I really think that's a good point I want to take just a second to address, and if people need to hop off, that's okay. Sometimes when we are trying to plan for some of these activities, it means that we might need to switch around the whole routine, right, in the morning. So if we want to work in a half hour of meditation in the morning, it might mean that we then need to push our waking up time up earlier, and that might mean we need to push our bedtime earlier. So we really want people to think through these things so they can address the barriers, and it's trial and error. Find what works for you as you go. I'm not seeing any questions pop up in the Q&A. So again, we really invite you to email us at any time. We would love to get back to you about whatever questions that you have. Everything that we talked about, we have articles about on our website. So if you want to do just a little reading on your own, feel free. And with that, I'm just going to say thank you so much. I will point out that we do have our entire schedule up for our webinars, and they are listed on our website, and I can share that with anybody who's interested. They're on a variety of different topics. I just wanted to point that out for people who might be interested in future webinars. So with that, if you have no more questions or don't have any other questions, we just want to thank you all so much, and please check in with us and let us know how things are going.
Thank you, guys.